Not long ago, CPA Australia released a publication, not the only one with a publication, Russ, we released a publication, Australia's Competitiveness, From Lucky Country to Competitive Country, that looked at Australia's competitiveness. Now, equally, Norman, it could look at New Zealand's competitiveness, so the question's really to both of you. The study involved a survey of over 6,000 respondents, business leaders and decision makers worldwide. Now, one of the conclusions of that study, and this touches on your point, I think, Norman, about the size of the tax pie and competitiveness and business and how do we make the revenue larger, really. It concluded that Australia's at a crossroads or a tipping point, and we need to lift our game if we are to successfully compete in what we've been calling the Australasian century. So how do we compete internationally? I think you've both speakers have clearly articulated the growth challenge, but the question really is, if we're at this tipping point, if we're at a crossroads, the fiscal deficit numbers demonstrate that, what do we do? How do we address this? Who'd like to start?
It's a multifaceted challenge. If you're talking about international competitiveness, the measure is the real exchange rate. And the resources boom from 2003 to the peak in 2013 caused an appreciation of the real exchange rate in Australia of 70%. There's been no OECD country that's had such an appreciation of the real exchange rate that's been sustained. Japan had that for a while. Well, with the very low inflation, maybe Japan is a comparator, but it was quite challenging for Japan. That doesn't matter if you've got some industries that can continue to invest, some tradable industries, export and import competing industries, continue to invest and expand at the very high real exchange rate. But where we got to, we had rendered internationally uncompetitive almost all trade-exposed industries. So since 2011, we've had very little investment outside resources in trade-exposed industries, and now we're finding that even in the resources sector, with the decline in export prices, it's only the richest of the resource deposits that warrant investment. So it's the extraordinary appreciation of the real exchange rate that has led to this decline in competitiveness. That has to come down. Now, you can bring that down by having productivity growth faster than the rest of the world. And that's what we should try to do. But you can't, but if you, even at the peak of our performance, when we were top of the OECD for 5 years in the 1990s, we're only about a percentage point above the average of the OECD. So if we're relying on higher productivity growth alone to chip back the 30 or 40% of improvement in competitiveness that we may need, in dog days I talked about 20 to 40% from the peak decline in competitiveness in 2013, then it would take you 20, 30, 40 years. So we need, in addition, a big nominal depreciation of the exchange rate associated with income restraint. Now, we're actually getting a bit of that. We've had a 10% depreciation since the peak in early 2013, and we are getting wage restraint. Real wages have fallen in Australia in the last year. That's very unusual. So the labour market's working in support of that real depreciation. But the phenomenon of monopoly in our non-traded sector has intensified during the Great Australian Complacency, and there's very strong resistance to compression of nominal income. So there's a pass-through of the price effects of exchange rate depreciation through a lot of the non-traded sector. That's a problem of competition policy. It's a problem of the way we regulate natural monopolies. The centrepiece of an improvement of competitiveness has to be a large nominal depreciation with income restraint supported by far-reaching productivity-raising reform focused especially on monopoly in the non-traded sector.
Norman.
Well, I guess I'd only add to that I mean, in many ways, Australia and New Zealand are quite similar in this respect, but where you have the word minerals, we have the word dairy. So, you know, we've had terms of trade effects largely through agricultural sector and dairy sector in particular. Economics is not called the dismal science for nothing. So, you know, we're better at pointing out the problems than we are at pointing out the solutions. But I know Murray Sherwin is here from New Zealand Productivity Commission, and I think he'd probably agree that after intensive examination of what drives New Zealand's productivity, the Commission still refers to the productivity puzzle. And that is, despite all the reforms, a lot of work that's been done over the last 2 or 3 decades in New Zealand, productivity, we've managed to stop the slide in productivity relative to the rest of the world and probably relative to Australia, but we haven't found the answer that gets us back up the league. So I don't have answers to that question probably any more than anybody else does, and maybe Murray would struggle in the light of what even the Productivity Commission has done.
Thank you. We've got a question at the front here. And Mike on the way, right behind you. Thank you.
Alan Fells, Melbourne Uni. Just
Thanks,
to
Alan.
pick up very briefly on Ross Garneau's point about monopoly being quite strong in the non-traded sector. Part of that, of course, is the public sector itself. And I think one of the big issues that will start to emerge is the role of choice and competition in public markets of health, education, provision of public services and so on. So I anticipate seeing that come through. We picked up slightly different language about it this morning from the Treasurer and the Finance Minister.
Thanks, Alan. Now I've got the light in my eyes. I can see a question down, or a hand up down here. Yes, you're heading in the right direction, Mr. Mike Mann. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear?
Yes,
Thank
you're
you.
on.
Rex Dayton-Smith, regulatory and public policy consultant. Joe Hockey spoke this morning about shifting fiscal expenditures away from consumption and toward investment in the interest of sustainability.
Can you just keep the mic up closer to your mouth because you're fading in and out?
In the interest of sustainability.
It might be the mic.
Thanks. Bill English followed up by talking about some of the changes that they were making in expenditure on public services. Now, those expenditures, I guess most people would classify as consumption expenditures, but I think Bill made a good case that they were looking at those expenditures in terms of being investment expenditures, the return on which was the reduction in the kinds of welfare expenditures on prisons as it might be in the future, due to the success, hopefully, of these policies. It raised the question in my mind of how we distinguish between consumption, investment expenditures, sustainable and unsustainable fiscal expenditures in the context of the choices that we have to make in the future, and I'd be interested in your comments on that.
So, I mean, I absolutely agree with the point that I think that lies behind your question, which is public expenditure for consumption purposes and investment purposes. It's all there designed to deliver stuff that we want. If we want better health services and that involves paying higher wages to nurses, that's absolutely fine. If we want better roads, that's absolutely fine. They will have different consequences for future levels of income. And so we might typically expect, it's probably not always true, but we might typically expect that investment expenditures will deliver a better output performance in the future. Otherwise, why are we, as it were, giving up consumption now in order to deliver something in the future? I think my concern for fiscal policy in the future is, well, concern is perhaps not the right word, my perspective is that there is going to be increased demand for things like health expenditures in the future. We've seen that through the demographic transition. Health expenditure and health production might be, on average, a relatively low productivity activity. And if it is, you expect to see productivity growth being slower or lower than it was in the past. And that's legitimate. If society wants to spend more on health because we're aging, we might have to appreciate that investment expenditures on infrastructure that appear to be productive will not be the things that we're going to undertake more in the future. And that's why I think society's choices about these things are really important. Consumption expenditures are, after all, what we're all about. We're all about producing better living standards for more people now and in the future.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, I think we've got to take some care between the traditional distinction between capital expenditure and consumption expenditure, and associating the former with growth and the latter with the absence of growth. A lot of consumption expenditures, if they are properly focused and provided efficiently, can contribute to economic output. Well-designed health and education programs are essential inputs into economic growth, and you arbitrarily cut back on some of those things at your peril. Perhaps the highest returns on investment at all are in certain kinds of education, but they are treated in the national accounts as consumption expenditure. Second caution is capital expenditure is not necessarily helpful to economic growth. We've had, or to productivity growth. The two sectors with the biggest declines in productivity over the past decade are mining for some special reasons, but the second is utilities, an average decline in productivity of 4.5% per annum. That is because we had massive investment in utilities. First of all, electricity and gas networks, secondly, water networks, without any increase in output. A lot of that was straightforwardly wasteful investment encouraged by a distorted regulatory regime. So that capital expenditure would have shown up very nicely as capital expenditure in the national accounts, but it actually led to a decline in productivity, not an increase in productivity. Similarly, investment in transport, carefully allocated and implemented investment in transport infrastructure can raise productivity, but poorly allocated expenditure can reduce productivity. And we've had an awful lot of the latter. And to be confident that investment in transport infrastructure will be helpful to economic growth, we would have to introduce quite new disciplines into evaluation of projects before approval.
We've got a question up the front here. If we can get a mic up the front, please. Yes, one on the way. Thank you.
Helen Sullivan, Melbourne School of Government. Thanks very much for an injection of economics. I'm sure that was just what we all really needed to get us going. My question's specifically addressed at Ross, but I'd welcome reflections from both of you. Ross, you've talked a lot in your book, and you talk consistently about the public interest. And I just wonder, in the context of very diverse and fragmented populations where internationalisation has given us the opportunities for mobility, where digital technology creates all kinds of fragmentations, is it now possible to think about a public interest? And if it is, how do we do that in such a way that it becomes tangible and meaningful for people, many of whom have an interest in their own their own idea of the public interest, but perhaps might not share in a more collective, dare I use the word, public interest?
That's a very challenging question, Helen. It's really a question about whether democracy has a good future. And that's a hard question. On the relationship between increased diversity, globalization, internationalization of perspectives and the public interest, one particular dimension of this is very important, is the decline of the national corporation. Rod Carnegie, former chairman of the Business Council, former chairman of CRA at the time, the second biggest company in Australia, commented to me when he was chair of the Business Council that for him a surprising consequence of business globalization was that it was no longer possible to get business focused on promotion of good policy in the public interest in Australia, because that was no longer a particular interest even of Australian-based companies, because only a small part of their income or a proportion of income came in Australia. So whether Australia as a whole did well or poorly was not a matter of consequence for their shareholders and for executives who were at least notionally rewarded on the basis of how well they delivered the objectives of shareholders. And there was a time in Australia where the major corporations were major supporters of public institutions, like the Institute of International Affairs. But now they play much smaller roles in that. So that's just one corner of the problem. And another corner is the one to which Norman referred. The mobility of people places some limits on certain kinds of taxation. This is a huge challenge. I think there still is a community of interest amongst people who live in this country or New Zealand or another country. But political leaders have a much larger task in distilling a sense of common public interest, and participants in the public discussion have a much more challenging task, and there are fewer citizens who will feel it's worth their time to contribute to that. Rod Carnegie's example. I don't think that it's impossible. If it were impossible, the only future for democracy would be through the gradual emergence of a global democracy, which of course is a very challenging task.